We wanted to get to this a little earlier, but I'm glad we're going to deal with this because this has become a rather big issue, certainly in terms of, I guess, the difference between what Quebec wants to do and what the federal government thinks it should do, and that's over the issue of medical assistance in dying. So you may remember it's about, 2 weeks ago now, the federal government announced it was delaying plans by 3 years, so until 2027, to extend medical assistance in dying to people whose only medical condition is a mental illness, which goes against what Quebec's policy has been and which has led to a bit of a standoff, I guess, if you can call it that. Aaron Derfel of the Montreal Gazette has written about this, and we wanted to bring you up to date on what exactly is going on. Aaron, I want to make sure I have all the facts right here. So we know that in Quebec, Quebec was the first province to adopt legislation over medical assistance in dying in Canada. And things to have, I think, if I'm not mistaken, things have gone reasonably well in that area. So why is there an issue now?
Well, the issue is having to change the criminal code just for Quebec. This is what Quebec wants right now. It wants an amendment to the criminal code that would just apply to Quebec, so that in the event of someone, just let's backtrack a little bit. In this past June, Quebec updated its law on MAID, or medical assistance in dying, and under that law, people who are in the early stages of dementia would be able to make advance requests for medical assistance in dying at a point in their lives when they lose the mental capacity to do so. Now, in order for this to be carried out, you need an amendment to the criminal code, and the criminal code applies from coast to coast. It applies to every province. The federal government is worried that this could create a perverse effect where some people in Ontario or other provinces might go to Quebec for medical assistance in dying earlier than the legislation. It's very, very complicated, but they don't want a situation where people in other provinces go to Quebec because Quebec has a slightly different criminal code than the rest of the country.
I mean, as the law stands now, you could do that, could you not? You could live in, I don't know, Saskatchewan and decide, because the rules there don't allow you to federally to do it, to come to Quebec and go through the process here?
No. The way there are MAID legislation is it's a federal law,
right?
So you can do this across the country. And some provinces have slightly different legislation. So Ottawa has been considering expanding MAID. So right now, MAID applies to people. The most common example would be someone suffering from terminal cancer. Ottawa had considered, but then put off. Has actually passed a law on this, but then wants to put off its application for 3 years for people with mental illness. And Quebec has its own law in June, and this would be for people with dementia. So what the governments, all these various governments are doing is they're expanding MAID for people with other conditions. And in order to do that, you have to amend the criminal code. So it's a very tricky legal process. But, the subtext of this is that Quebec, which was the first province to adopt legislation for medically assisted dying, wants to assert its authority. Healthcare is a provincial jurisdiction. And, the CAQ government is very nationalist. They're doing this in conjunction with the Bloc Québécois, and they want to assert their authority, and they feel that Ottawa is intruding on their, health jurisdiction.
Yeah, which is unusual. That almost never happens, right, where the province thinks Ottawa's sticking its nose into its own business. But that said, I want to understand here the federal announcement, which was we're going to extend this 3 years before we, in fact, come up with a new decision. I think what they said was the health minister at the time, Mark Holland, said, we want to make sure we get this right. What did that even mean?
Yeah, so there's been a growing backlash against this idea of expanding MAID to include people who just have a mental illness. Because think about it, there are sometimes people go through a very difficult crisis in their life, and they might be suicidal, but it passes. And then they have a different outlook on life. They don't want to kill themselves. But so because of this, you have certain mental health professionals who say it's a very dangerous, slippery slope to expand medical illness to people whose only condition is a mental illness as opposed to terminal cancer. So this is caught up to the federal government, and it's very tricky. And so when Mark Holland, the federal health minister, is talking about the system's not ready, I presume he's talking about mental health services, that they're rushing in headlong into this. I don't think the Quebec legislation is focusing on expanding MAID for people with mental illness, but rather those who are suffering from the early stages of Alzheimer's. So Quebec finds this very insulting because they say, look, you have these people who, they end up, losing their mind as they're in the final months or years of Alzheimer's, and they're suffering, and they should be eligible for medical assistance in dying. But under the current law, you have to be of sound mind to make the request. Unless you can do it earlier in your life, when you know you're suffering, or you're going to be suffering from severe dementia down the road.
Right. So you make that decision while you're still well, and then you want that to be honored by the time you're no longer able to make that decision.
Yes.
Okay.
And so Quebec believes that's reasonable, and it gives people dignity, and it's a very, very emotional issue. But what's happened is that Ottawa, which has jurisdiction over the criminal code, the criminal law is a federal responsibility. It's holding things up.
Yeah.
And it just feels that this whole issue has to be assessed and reassessed. They've got to take their time. And so, Quebec has said, listen, you sometimes amended the criminal code provincially for things like lotteries. Do it for MAID. But Ottawa's response is that this could trigger, unintended consequences where, you have a slightly different criminal code in Quebec than the rest of the country.
Right.
And then with maybe an influx of people going to Quebec for a medical assistance in dying in the case of dementia.
Sure. So, I'll ask you to speculate. How does this end? How does this play out?
I think that what's happening here is that the number of MAID deaths, medically assisted deaths in Quebec, went up 42% last year. It's, I believe, the highest in the world. Quebec's MAID rate is the highest. It's higher than Belgium. And the Quebec government has responded by setting up a task force to look into this. And as the federal government seeks to expand MAID, it just gives rise to all these kinds of tricky issues. So I think they're just taking their sweet time on this. It's an emotional issue. The church, the Catholic Church, is actually suing Quebec over its law. I don't think it will result in any changes quickly. And I think that for political reasons, maybe the Bloc Québécois wants to pick a fight with Ottawa. But I don't think that this is going to really resonate and turn into a constitutional crisis, for example.
Okay. Aaron, as always, I appreciate the time. So it sounds like we're not going to see anything change here in a big hurry.
Exactly.
Okay. Aaron Derfel of the Montreal Gazette. Thanks, Aaron.